I just want to say, pulling on what we just heard in that really powerful panel, some of the words that were actually kind of echoing in my ears as I was hearing some of what these panelists were sharing are words I wanted to bring into this room. And so I went to find the full quote. And they're words from one of my mentors in the legal world, someone named Peter Gable, who actually is the founder of an organization called the Project for Integrating Spirituality, Law, and Politics. And what he wrote about Social Security, I was really feeling in the ethos of that last conversation. Some number of years ago, he wrote, "Imagine how different the public debate would be if Social Security were understood as a great historical step forward in human community." Beautifully affirming that we are in this world together rather than alone, right? And I think that's something that sometimes we forget as we get right into budgets, as we get right into solvency conversations and numbers, and we lose that perspective about that intergenerational interdependence that Social Security so beautifully embraces. So I am really excited to transition from that last conversation into this next one, and I'm really grateful to the amazing panelists that we have joining us for this, because what they're going to be doing is helping us to think about Social Security and from the standpoint of what its role in the economy is. A lot of times when we hear about Social Security and the economy, the frame is one of, oh, what does it cost, or how does it affect the economy? But what we don't necessarily get as much of is that understanding of what it means to families, to communities, and what it looks like as an actual pillar of our larger economy. And that's really what this panel is going to do. And I'm especially grateful to the amazing Lorie Konish, who's going to be moderating this conversation. If you don't know Lorie already, then I'm going to say what I sometimes say, which is you're doing it wrong. She's an amazing reporter at CNBC who is so good at weaving together people into policy and economic conversations. One of my favorite who covers Social Security, and I can't think of anyone better to moderate this next conversation. So Lorie, I'm going to hand it to you and I'll let you introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm so excited to be here to talk about Social Security's impact on the economy. And when we look at the numbers, they're really massive in terms of the program's impact. The National Institute on Retirement Security had research that came out last year that found 1.38 trillion in benefits paid to more than 67 million beneficiaries, supports around 805 billion in labor income, 16 trillion in value added to GDP, 363 billion in tax revenues for federal, state, and local governments, and that a 19% cut to benefits would shrink the program's impact by more than 16% and reduce GDP by hundreds of billions of dollars. So we're at a point when, the program is facing a shortfall, and the impact of the decisions that lawmakers are going to make are really going to be huge. And I have a great panel of experts with me here today to talk about some of the different facets that should be considered in this conversation. I'm going to ask them to give brief introductions, and I'll start with our gentleman on the screen. If you can just introduce yourself. Oh, there he is.
Sure, hopefully you all can hear me. I'm Jason Fichtner. I'm actually a policy fellow at the National Academy of Social Insurance. And I am calling in today from San Juan, where I'm down here for work for the Puerto Rico Pension Reserve Trust. And I know Rebecca was expecting me to show up today on the beach holding a pina colada, but instead I'm in a conference room and our pina colada machine is broken. But I'm glad I could be able to dial in today. And I apologize in advance. I do have a hard stop at noon. I have a meeting with the Fiscal Oversight Board. I've got to get across town, so I need to hop off at noon with you guys.
My name's Tyler Bond. Until recently, I was the research director at the National Institute on Retirement Security, and I was one of the co-authors of the research that Lorie referenced from last year, but I'm transitioning into a role as a senior fellow here at the Academy, and so today I'll be speaking in my capacity as a senior fellow at the Academy.
Hello? Okay. Hi, I'm Stephen Nuñez. I am the Director of Stratification Economics at the Roosevelt Institute. Obviously, we have some interest in Social Security, so happy to be here to chat with you today.
I'm Chantel Sheaks. I am Vice President of Retirement Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
And I'm Chad Bolt, Senior Vice President for Economic Security at First Focus on Children. Good to see everybody.
So I'd like to start by just having each expert talk about what facet you specifically are looking at in terms of Social Security's impact on the economy, and how should we talk about that in terms of helping to plan for its future. I don't know if Jason, you want to start again?
I'd be happy to. Thank you. And this is one where we start thinking about Social Security, and I was actually on listening to the last panel, and so I kind of want to reiterate something Kathleen Merman said about thinking about Social Security as the insurance value, but this is about sort of Social Security's role in the economy in general. And Tyler mentioned the NERS report that came out, and Lorie, you mentioned it too. And I think it's important to think about Social Security as the foundation of retirement security and what that means for the economy. It provides financial support to millions of retirees. It ensures a basic standard of living and reducing poverty among the elderly Americans. We're talking about 65 million people receiving Social Security benefits in 2025. So that's retirees, people with disabilities, survivors. And this is a lot of economic stimulus. Benefits are spent directly in local economies. They support business, they create jobs, they generate tax revenue. Social Security last year put out $1.5 trillion in benefits. And you can debate about how much of that is economic stimulus versus multiplier effects. And NERS had a report as well. But 1.5 trillion just on its own can generate upwards of 2.5 trillion in activity. And that supports about 8 million to 12 million jobs in 2023 alone. So it's a big economic impact. And again, it protects against economic downturns. It's sort of an automatic stabilizer. During recessions or market volatility, Social Security acts as that stabilizer. It maintains household income when other resources may falter. And depending on what report you look at from Social Security, more than 1/3 of seniors rely on Social Security for at least 90% of their income. This makes it critical in times of uncertainty. And I'll pause there.
Tyler, you mentioned the NERS research that you did last year. How are you looking at the impact on the U.S. economy now?
Yeah, so really going to be building off of a lot of what Jason just said. So the research that we did last year, we really wanted to look at what happens when beneficiaries spend their money. Most of that money is spent, right? When older adults, when Americans with disabilities, when survivors receive their benefit checks, they go out and spend it, right? They buy food, they buy gas, they buy medicine. And so we wanted to focus on what impact does that then have on the economy? And what we found is basically it has a 2-for-1 impact. For each dollar of benefits paid out through Social Security, it generates $2 of economic activity. So as Jason said, we calculated that this supported 12 million jobs in 2023, which was the year that we analyzed in our research. $2.6 trillion of total economic output. And some of the key industries that were supported by the spending of these Social Security benefits were retail, restaurants, and the healthcare sector. I don't think any of that's surprising when we think about where people are most likely to spend their Social Security benefits. But we really wanted to draw attention to the fact that this money does go back into the economy, right? I think oftentimes the way Social Security gets talked about here in DC, it's almost like it's this black box, right? And we are putting all this money into the program, but there's not as much talk then on, well, what happens once that money is paid out in benefits? And then I think the broader point that I would say here, and this echoes what has been said throughout the 2 days of this summit, is, we can talk about all these really big numbers that we, came up with in our report last year, but the biggest economic impact of Social Security is on people's lives, right? Jason referenced the number of people who depend on Social Security for the overwhelming majority of their income, right? The biggest economic impact this program has is on individual people's lives. But we do want to acknowledge that there is also an impact on the broader economy as well.
Stephen, you have new research that talks about Social Security's impact on the economy and specifically income inequality. What are you looking at there?
Thanks. So last year was the 90th anniversary of the Social Security Act. So Roosevelt decided that we wanted to take advantage of that to start calling attention to the state of the program and to, I think, some people's misconceptions about the program. It's really common to talk to people, young people, and to hear that Social Security is not going to be there for me, or Social Security is going to go bankrupt. I had conversations on Tuesday night at the reception with folks who are experts in other policy areas, in Medicare and Medicaid and so forth. Basically heard the same thing from them. So this is pretty broad spread, even among people who are very well educated. So I wanted to look back at the last several decades of Social Security and say, what's happening in 2033, right? Why, one, do people think that Social Security is going to go bankrupt as opposed to the trust fund reserve will be depleted in such a way that Congress will have to act as they have in the past? And two, why are we at this stage 30 years earlier than we thought we were going to be? And the answer is, although people tend to think, oh, it's because of the dependency ratio. There's a lot of old people. It's the boomers' fault, right? But the truth of the matter is that the trustees' report back at that time accurately projected longevity, accurately predicted retirement age, accurately predicted falls in fertility rates, accurately predicted the glut of people who are going to retire when they were going to retire. So the demographics were basically spot on, and they continue to be spot on. So these are problems in an abstract sense, the dependency ratio and so forth, but they're not why we're here today. Why we're here today is largely because although average earnings over this time period, these last several decades, were, again, pretty spot on in terms of the prediction, the distribution of that earnings was not. We have the top 6% of earners gained the vast majority of those earnings gains over the last several decades. And as a result, Social Security, which the FICA taxes, which at the time in 1983 were capturing taxes on about 90% of eligible earnings, are now around 82, 83%. It fluctuates a little bit. That's been basically constant since about the year 2000. This has stripped the reserve of funding that people anticipated using, right? The idea was that sometime in the early 2020s, we were going to have to start tapping into this because of the baby boom retirement. And instead, we had to do it in 2009. So the reserves didn't grow the way that they were supposed to grow. The second thing, honestly, is the Great Recession. If you want to talk about the economy, right? You can't predict every economic downturn, but over a 75-year period or so, it's basically going to smooth out. But there was an anomaly in the Great Recession, not just the depth of the recession, but how long it took to return to trend. Our fiscal response was just not sufficient. And that meant, stagnant earnings again. It also meant people who were going to retire early in a way that meant that although they're retiring early at a penalty, and that's another conversation we could have about the sufficiency of our safety net, they ended up retiring earlier than anticipated and pulling those costs closer to the modern time. So we have poor macroeconomic policy and we have unexpected income inequality. And then we have a whole bunch of people who are using this perception among young folks that Social Security is going to go bankrupt to essentially undermine the program and to say we need to cut your benefits because rich people got too rich over the last 4 decades. So, I think we're trying to get folks to understand why we are at where we're at, what it actually means, but also to do a call to action to get people to actually start working on this. Because if we had responded to this A decade ago, the trade-offs would be different. If we had responded to be 2 decades ago, the trade-offs would have been different. The longer we wait, the harder this is going to get. So I think we're trying to get people to pay attention and to start thinking about how we're going to make this a better program and how we're going to keep it working going forward. And sorry if I took too much time there.
Oh, that's okay. Chantel, what are you watching from the business and employer perspective?
Actually, you kind of opened that up for me, so thank you. You had the perfect lead in. Mine is kind of a call to action for employers, because this is just not something employers have been thinking about. The last week, everybody was bothering me about Trump accounts because the comments are due on Friday if you haven't filed your comments yet. But HR departments have so many other things to think about. We've just had we had Secure 2.0, we have lawsuits, we have this, we have that, and this is not on their radar. And they pay half of it. And I brought some, this is from 2023, and I actually had to Google some of it, how to actually say it, because the number was so damn big. In 2023, payroll taxes were $1.2 trillion. That's a lot. So now if we start thinking about, okay, the employer pays half, the employee pays half. So if I just increase the payroll tax by 1%, that's $6.165 billion per year. The fact I had to Google this to figure out how to say it because it was so big makes me think that this has to come from someplace. And when employers look at things, by way of background, I am an ERISA attorney. I'm recovering. I'm on step like 4 or 5. I just can't kick the habit. They look at things in buckets. When I work with HR departments, this is the retirement bucket. This is the payroll bucket. This is my research and development bucket. If someone comes up to the CEO and says, I need an additional 1%, and most policymakers think 1% just isn't that much money. I don't know. I think $6 billion is a lot of money every year. And now if we add that on top of getting rid of the wage base, think about the employer who has different depending on the industry, you could have quite a few people, even some small employers, if you look at the professions, who have a lot of people at wage base. The money has to come from somewhere. There's not, the Social Security fairy who's going to come down and magically come out with this money. The most logical step that we think, we don't know for sure, is to think that it's probably going to come out from the private sector retirement plan. Many of our employers have very generous matches, 3%, 5%, 6%. Chamber has a wonderful match. But if I were the CFO, and I'm like, well, if I have to get another 1% here, why is my match now 4%? Why can't I drop down the match or the non-elective contribution? What about healthcare costs? Healthcare costs for employers last year went up 10%. There's another place that money's going to come out of. Money's fungible, it's a pool, but if we don't, to my point, if we don't start acting today, most employees and employers can be like the frog in the water. If you do 0.1%, I can handle that. 0.1%, the CFO isn't going to be breathing down my neck. 1%, the CFO is going to be breathing down my neck. So ours is more of a call to action, because not only is this a monetary issue, for us, this is also a workforce management issue. If I can't have my people retire because they don't have the money, there's a statistics of, a quarter of people have nothing saved for retirement. And between the median for people between 54 and 64 is 104,000. Social Security is part of this. The systems work together. The private and the public work together. But if you now have employees, even in the survey that we did together, employees were happy to do that 1%. But if they have to come up with that 1% tomorrow, they're probably going to not contribute to the private plan. So now I have you equal on Social Security, but you may have 1% to 2% less from your private plan. So that's not a good thing, because we need to start thinking about this now, and we need to start thinking about it holistically.
Chad, you're focused on an area that many people don't talk about when it comes to Social Security, and that's children. What are you seeing with the impact there?
Sure. First, I want to say yesterday I wore a fresh, crisp pair of white Lacoste sneakers, and today I'm wearing a busted old pair of black dress shoes. So I really did this wrong for the day that we're talking about what shoes we're showing up in. But I'm glad you asked that, Lorie, because yeah, at least we're all matching up here. I'm glad you asked because it's a question I get. You know, what is the kids guy from First Focus on Children doing on the Social Security panel? And folks in this room probably know, but generally most people don't, that Social Security actually serves 2.5 million children, either because their parents are deceased, disabled, or retired. And outside of the tax code, Social Security is actually the largest anti-poverty program that we have for children. And so we've been talking, especially today, about these big questions about what society do we want to live in, and how do we support each other. And when the architects of the New Deal were thinking about those questions with respect to Social Security, they had children in mind. And they actually added child survivors to the Social Security system all the way back in 1939. So child survivor benefits have been a core part of Social Security, basically the entirety of its existence. And today, 1.3 million children who have lost a parent receive Social Security benefits. And I really appreciate something that Kathleen said on the previous panel when she talked about Social Security functioning like insurance. I mean, the child survivor benefits really do function as Social Security as its most fundamental purpose in this case, which is insurance against the loss of a parent, of course, because losing a parent has tremendous economic effects for a household. Oftentimes this happens unexpectedly, and those negative economic effects can follow a child well into adulthood. And obviously these survivor benefits help mitigate those negative effects. Then, of course, there's another million kids who are served by SSI, Supplemental Security Income. And these are kids, as folks in the room know, who have complex medical needs. They have musculoskeletal disorders. They have, visual and hearing impairments, other issues that make raising them for their parents very expensive, and oftentimes just expenses that insurance just doesn't cover. And so, though the benefits are modest, the monthly SSI benefits really are a lifeline for these kids. And so, when we think about debates around Social Security moving forward, we really need to keep front and center these kids who have lost parents, kids with complex medical needs. We need to make sure that the system continues to serve them in any discussion about solvency that plays out in the years ahead.
Thank you. Jason, we've talked a bit about the demographics. I know you've done a lot of research about peak 65. What are you seeing there in terms of the economic impact of that generation, and what can we learn about retirement security from them?
So we're in a phase now through 2027 where 11,200 people are turning 65 every day. That's 4.1 million people a year. And these are the boomers that are retiring, and we're looking at their financial security. And I think one of the things that Stephen sort of mentioned is that income growth has not been uniform. So the wage growth has been different. That also goes for the assets leading into retirement. So there are some people that are doing very well, some that are doing okay, and some that aren't doing well at all. And there's been a major shift from the defined benefit pension plans that people used to get to now the defined contribution plans that Chantel mentioned that employers are paying for. And so it's kind of shifted the risk. But what's happened is that we used to talk about the three-legged stool, which consisted of Social Security, your defined benefit pension plan, and personal savings. And now that DB plan, which gave people protected income with Social Security, is now deficient or mostly gone away for people who aren't in the public sector. And so we're now to look at that defined contribution plan assets as part of that three-legged stool, and how do we help people convert some of that asset base into protected income on top of Social Security? So it's like a reformed rethinking of a three-legged stool. If you don't have assets to put into like an annuity, then you're still stuck and you're relying on Social Security. And I think as we start thinking about reforms, we have to go back to the idea of who needs these benefits and at what level, and who doesn't, and who can afford to take some of the brunt of any reductions that may or may not happen if we do something regarding solvency. And I want to add something because Stephen mentioned this about, and Sean too, a call for action. 15 years ago, when I was the deputy commissioner of Social Security, I would sign those trustees reports that come out. I was the secretary of the board of trustees. And 15 years ago, if we had just done the elimination of the taxable maximum for Social Security, I'm not saying it's the best policy, but if we had just gotten rid of it 15 years ago, that would have put us back on 75-year solvency, that one policy. Today, 15 years later, it gets you 30 to 50%, depending on how you do it and if you adjust for benefits. We have already lost that window. The call for action about if things get worse the longer we wait, we're now 6 years away potentially from trust fund depletion. The difference between today and 6 years from now is actually very small. We've lost that window. What we have to do now is actually start preparing people and actually start talking about what reforms we think are reasonable to do now. So if we wait 6 years from now, the bond market may force us to do it. We won't have a chance to actually do it in a meaningful, policy-oriented way. The gap that Social Security is going to have between payroll taxes coming in and benefits going out could be $300 and $400 billion per year. Most likely, Congress will try to borrow some money to give time for reform. Congress seems to like to wait to the last minute to do anything. The question is, will the bond market allow it? And if so, for how long? And my concern is, and this is Chantel's point, if we don't start raising the alarm today, so we can get in place meaningful reforms that are balanced, equitable, fair, and protect people, then we're going to be forced to do something much more radical that could harm people 6 years from now if we wait till trust fund depletion.
Excellent points. Tyler, what have you seen in terms of your research in terms of retirement security and how benefits could be shaped in the future going forward to really make sure that's strong enough?
Yeah, first thing I was going to say is that I have 2 young children at home, and the next time the Tooth Fairy visits our house, I'm going to ask her to introduce us to the Social Security Fairy to help get us out of this mess. But short of that occurring, I think Jason, touched on a lot of the big shifts we've seen in the retirement landscape, right? For most private sector workers now, unless you're in a large employer in a unionized workforce, it's very unlikely that you still have a defined benefit pension. Now, most public employees do, but even there, since the global financial crisis, we've seen some erosion of pension benefits in the public sector. So Social Security really is the foundation of retirement security in the US. And I think Chantel is great at always making this point that the private employer-provided savings system needs to be seen as operating with Social Security. And we shouldn't see these as separate programs because in real people's lives, they're not. It's money, right? People just need money to pay for things. I get some money from Social Security. I get some money from my 401k. I get some money from, working part-time as a greeter at Walmart, right? It's just money that they need to pay for things. But I think kind of tying it into the economic impact of the program, one of the things that we wanted to sort of convey with the research that we put out last year is that any changes to the program are going to have an economic impact, right? So again, what that economic impact will be is going to depend a lot on what ultimately happens 6 years from now. I, for one, don't think that Congress is going to just allow indiscriminate benefit cuts to occur, because I'm pretty sure that's going to be a political death knell for every sitting member of Congress. And the way Congress seems to operate these days sure seems like they're just going to borrow the money to pay benefits. And as Jason just said, they haven't left themselves many other options at this point. But given how much deficit financing we're already doing, how is the economy going to respond if Congress is like, well, we're just going to throw some money at this and then we'll figure something out down the road? That doesn't seem very plausible to me as a solution. But again, as others have said, if we're, suddenly start increasing contributions, where's that money going to come from, right? If we do allow benefit cuts, of 19, 20% to occur, our research from last year found that, that would have a 16.5% reduction in total economic output. That's 2 million fewer jobs supported, right? Millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, in less GDP produced. So we're looking at a whole range of possible economic impacts depending on exactly what occurs 6-ish years from now. But the broader point is there's going to be an economic impact, and we should start thinking about that now so that we can actually be prepared for when this comes, rather than just, oh, suddenly this happened in a presidential election year, by the way.
Well, and one thing to point out is that if you think about the timing of it, many of the people we've elected right now are like, I can push this down the road, push it down the road. Every new senator that comes in, it's your problem now. Mm-hmm. And so I think that might give us some hope to get some action. And that's part of what we want to do, is to say, no, this is a today problem. It's a problem for employers, it's a problem for employees, it's a problem for the economy. Fewer jobs means that you have less productivity, which is going to impact businesses. So this is something for all of us to think about, no matter what angle we're coming from.
Chad, you've talked about how we could improve the value of the program just now without action from Congress, right? To help children get their benefits that they're eligible for.
Yeah, maybe some good news here is that let me put forward an idea that requires no action from Congress. So the Bipartisan Social Security Advisory Board recently put out recommendations to improve access to and increase awareness of child survivor benefits, because estimates suggest that there's as many as 1 million kids eligible for but not getting child survivor benefits. And this is super easy stuff. For example, one recommendation is put the child survivor benefit application on the internet. It is not currently there. So it seems to me that this is pretty easy stuff to do, and it seems to me that members of Congress could really, in urging the Social Security Administration to take these easy steps to make more kids eligible for the benefits, or make sure kids receive the benefits they're already eligible for, they could take some credit for that, and it seems like something they might want to do. But I also want to encourage us not to concede that that discussions around, in the years ahead, around the future of Social Security and Social Security solvency need to leave us in a place where we hope that we come out of it, the best we can do is come out of it relatively unscathed. Like, I hope that we survive this debate. I think the dynamic that we are not layering into this conversation is the enduring popularity of Social Security and the political will of the American people to see it endure. I will remind everyone that the last time Congress made changes to Social Security, it was not that long ago. It was in December of 2024. We passed the Social Security Fairness Act, and it was to expand Social Security benefits. That is what the American people wanted to see, and it got done because of brute force of the American people and their political will to see a deeply unpopular set of penalties in place since the Social Security amendments in the 1980s get repealed. I think that is the level of engagement that you will see from people as we get further into and closer to, the so-called X date, and I think that's the dynamic that we're not thinking about here. And one other, maybe bright spot that I'll raise, and I'll plug the panel that comes after lunch, moderated by my friend and board colleague Tracy Croniger. There is bipartisan momentum to improve SSI, and if that can and should be part of ongoing debates around Social Security, and that's certainly not to cut the program, though that's to, for the first time in 40 years, update the eligibility rules and actually expand benefits and make sure that the program stops penalizing people for saving or for working or for getting married. And you'll hear more about that at the panel after lunch. But that's just other dynamics that I think we need to keep in mind as the conversations around Social Security move forward.
Yeah. In your panel yesterday, they politely talked about missed opportunity when it comes to HR 1, right? And some of the features there that maybe could have been improved, like the child tax credit, depending on your position on that. But I would pose this to the entire panel, which is, what features or, kinds of things would you like to see in future reform that can, preserve the program's value and economic impact?
If you don't mind. So I guess I just want to echo what Chad said. I have an SSI paper coming out on March 3rd, that does a microsimulation analysis of the SSI Restoration Act. So look forward to that.
Ooh,
but
excited.
But microsim. Okay. But a third of SSI recipients are over the age of 65. Most of them are receiving OASI also. So you can't talk about reforming Social Security without thinking about those sorts of interactions. You sometimes hear people, we're going to boost Social Security for poorer folks, and then that just gets eaten up by the one-to-one displacement that comes from receiving public benefits on SSI, and in a worst case scenario, you might actually boot people off Medicaid. So you don't want to do that, right? So if you're going to be doing this, you should be thinking about those interactions, but also because SSI is part of Social Security and it has been ignored for decades. If we're talking about the switch from defined benefits to defined contributions, well, congratulations, you have a $2,000 asset limit. So good luck saving for retirement if you're on SSI. So that's a huge part of things. The second thing, and this is kind of like the specter on this entire conference, is immigration, right? If you think about long-term support services, if you talk about the tax base for Social Security, immigration, because for the last several decades, with the exception of 1 year during the pandemic, we've had net positive immigration of 1.5 million people, 1.8 million people, et cetera. Last year we had 0. And this year we're likely to have somewhere around negative 900,000, right? If this becomes the new norm going forward, it makes all of these discussions a lot more difficult, because low taxes, broad base, everybody likes that. Shrunken base, these are the people who are actually paying for the benefits in a pay-go system. So you get rid of them, the taxes are going to have to go up higher. Right? So everybody, businesses, et cetera, should be thinking about what is currently happening in the United States, not to illegal immigration, but just to immigration broadly, and how that is going to benefit how that's going to impact our programs. The caregivers for long-term supportive services, the taxpayers who pay into these public pension systems, right? So I think we really do need to think about that, and that's something that is going to, unfortunately, have to be part of our calculus going forward, given that we've essentially decided to burn like one of the great advantages of the American economy. So I do want to
So
bring that up.
I'm gonna interrupt if it's okay quickly because I have to sign off. I apologize, but I wanted to say just a few last sort of words on sort of framing, and then I'll say goodbye. Um, we've been talking about the importance of Social Security in the economy, and I think part of the framing we have to make it echoes what the panel said about the need to raise awareness and get actions now, so we're not just facing this when it comes to trust fund depletion. But part of that framing is we've been talking about Social Security as a short-term budget item, and we kind of need to reframe that and start talking about Social Security as this long-term investment in the economy, the support it gives many people, and also the social cohesion it brings in. So it's kind of changing the framing. And as far as what those options should look like, there has to be a balance between the impact of taxes, as Chantel says, and the debt on the economy if we do borrowing, and then what policy options, who they harm, who they benefit, and making sure that it's fair and equitable. So we should focus those solutions on the insurance value of Social Security, which people have talked about, including myself and Kathleen Mormon earlier, and Chad mentioned it too. I think if we can use that framing, we have a better chance of getting the policy options and outcomes we want and need, as opposed to the ones we don't want happening in 6 years. And with that, I have to say goodbye. So thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jason. I'm getting the signal to wrap up, but any quick parting thoughts that the panelists would like to share?
I think for me, the one thing that I want to think about is let's not rob Peter to pay Paul. And let's look at this holistically instead of where we have so often been looking at it is, oh, well, I do Social Security. I'm a Social Security expert. I do private pensions and private retirement. I'm an expert in here. And each side is going off on their separate ways, and we need to come back together. And again, like the first panel was saying, go out in the field and talk to people because people think about them together. So as policymakers, we need to think about them together.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion, and hopefully next time when we convene, there'll be more progress on this.